Welcome to this ARCO and Later Life Alliance session. You're all extremely welcome. I'm Richard Best. I'm an independent in the House of Lords, and I chair the all-party parliamentary group on housing and care for older people. Housing and care, that's very much the theme of today, and we're going to launch a new report, hearing the voice of the consumer, the voices of older people and of the producers, the operators of retirement communities. ARCO has very helpfully in this new report set out definitions for us, which is a good and important starting point so that we understand what we're talking about. And the ARCO definition defines retirement housing as downsizing, sheltered accommodation, very much with housing as its main ingredient, retirement housing. And it also looks at the definition of care homes, where care is the key ingredient. And in between those two, retirement housing and care homes, comes housing with care, and that's the retirement communities that are particularly the subject of our discussion today. And I think what we're going to conclude, what this report concludes, is we need thousands more homes in retirement communities of this kind, the housing with care ingredient in that middle band between retirement housing and care homes. Just a quick word from me before we come to our star-studded cast of presenters and speakers. COVID. I fear the dreaded COVID has meant that retirement housing, just downsizing and going to somewhere more suitable, more manageable, easier to heat, easier to maintain, hopefully companionable. But that's taken a bit of a knock. People are less willing, I think, to think about moving out of the family home to somewhere rather smaller. They've got used to and recognized the value of space, of a garden, the garden that perhaps we'd thought of as becoming a bit of a burden. Maybe we've appreciated it a bit more, those of us of later years. I think downsizing may be slightly less popular per se, and care homes have certainly become less popular because sadly they have been the scene of where COVID has caused the most chaos and misery. So the retirement end and the care end, I fear, have taken a bit of a setback, but possibly housing with care, that middle ingredient that retirement communities aim at, maybe that has come into its own now, because this is where if you have suffered, and a lot of people have, from loneliness, from isolation, from being locked away in lockdown on your own, with no one to sort things out on an easy basis, people who can fix things, let alone people who are neighbors and can join in with you in all of the things that can happen if you're in a community of other people. Maybe this has come into its own. Maybe we've come to recognize that those social interactions are all important in our older age, and we may need to have more retirement communities, to think about moving to places where there's housing with care there for us as we get older. So maybe COVID has highlighted in its miserable way the value of what we're going to be talking about today. Well, shall we begin by hearing from Gareth Lyon, who's Policy and Communications Boss for ARCO, the Association of Retirement Community Operators. Gareth, tell us what's in the report and start us off, if you would.
Thank you very much, Lord Best. As you said, housing and care are incredibly topical at the moment politically, and it's also our members' experience that they've seen very significantly increased interest from older people in the sector. So to that end, we have partnered with Later Life Ambitions with a view to hearing what older people themselves have to say and what they might be looking for. So I'll just quickly take you through these slides and then you can hear from the panelists themselves. So the starting point for this is the fairly surprising finding, but perhaps less surprising in the context that you talked about, that a clear majority of older people are in fact interested in moving at this point. So about 56% of older people would be interested in moving if the right option was available to them. which leads to the question of what the right option would be for them. And we asked them about a range of factors that would be likely to motivate a move. Uh, Unsurprisingly, a lot of people are interested in the right location, and our understanding is that in most cases that means that people want to stay in or around the area they are already living in. But there are other factors which are also very significant. So access to facilities, whether that's nearby shops, transport facilities, medical facilities, are important. Being able to maintain and improve an independent lifestyle, the social factors that you referred to earlier on. Financial considerations are also important, but noticeable here is coming actually as the fourth most important factor. And of course, particularly in the current climate, older people are aware of the need to be able to cover themselves for potential care and support needs in future. And a clear majority are not interested in having to move again subsequently. We also asked them where they would be interested in moving, and the option which attracted the most interest was bungalows, which is always a popular downsizing option for people. But we did see a strong level of interest in all of the options that we asked about. And actually, in this context, it's fairly remarkable. 14.65% of older people were interested in what we refer to as the retirement community model, which is 24-hour staffing, care available on site. And this is notably much larger than the current level of provision, which exists for over 65s in this country, which is only about 0.8%. The percentage rises significantly when we ask them about the option of housing with care as an alternative to care homes. And here we saw over 70% of older people would be interested in that option. But set against this, in their local area, only fewer than 13% of people thought that there were sufficient downsizing options available, including those with care. So there's a clear difference between what is available to older people now and what they would like to be available as options to move. So it should therefore come as no surprise that nearly 90% of older people believe that the government should be acting in this area to increase the range of options which are available to older people, so that they can move and they can access care if they need it. And in terms of what that government's action should look like, there was strong support for a wide range of measures here. So certainly for developing better alternatives to care homes, for reforms to stamp duty to make it easier to move, providing more information about the choices, because there's still a huge level of huge extent to which is not very clear what the different options are and what the different terms that are used by the sector refer to. So therefore there'll be more need for clarity and for consumer protection, and for improvements to the planning system to expand demand, possibly underpinned by a national strategy. And certainly the form that we at ARCO have been advocating for that has been a cross-government task force, a housing with care task force, which would be designed to expand provision for older people. So the report goes on to make a number of recommendations. Several of these refer to expanding provision of housing and care options for older people, including planning reform. There's also some clear recommendations for the government and the sector where we both have to up our game here in terms of making sure that there is more clarity and certainty for consumers. And certainly that's something we've been working on at ARCO for some time through our consumer code. And it's something we're seeing increasing political interest in. And there was also some interest in the government looking at, whilst accepting the current fiscal restraints, looking at financial measures to make this more affordable and an easier option. So there's a wide range of actions which people believe should be taken here. But the key thing here is that we wanted to hear from older people's voices. And that's what the survey shows. That I think that's the sector talking enough. We were delighted to work with Later Life Ambitions on this. And we couldn't have asked for a better partner in terms of bringing access to 250,000 older people. And I think it's about time we heard from them as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gareth. Well, let's hear from your partners in this. Lisa Ray represents the Later Living Ambitions, an alliance of organisations that represent the pensioners themselves, 250,000 members. Lisa, thank you for partnering. Tell us your perspective on this.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto the panel today. It's great to be here to get a chance to put across the voices of older people. And our main aim in Later Life Ambitions is to push the government to come up with policy which supports older people to live fulfilling later lives. So obviously this was a great opportunity for us to work with ARCO on this report. We think that there's been a unique approach taken here in that they've asked sector providers, but also potential sector customers, for their views on what is being proposed. I think very often older people are told what is best for them, and this work has meant that we've actually been able to hear the real voices of our members. So we very much welcome the findings of the report, and it's very interesting to see that the findings match up very closely, in fact, to later life ambitions policy on housing. The report highlights the barriers in the way of older people right-sizing or downsizing, however you'd like to refer to it, to meet their needs in later life. Our later life ambitions policy highlights the distinct lack of housing suitable for older people. And when the housing white paper was published a few years ago, we were very disappointed to see that there was no attention really paid to retirement sector housing. And we agree that the next stage of planning reform really needs to focus on that section of the population. Of course, with this, if this focus did happen, it would not just be a benefit for older people. It would have an ongoing effect for their families and younger generations. There was some research done by Shelter a little while ago, and it said that if just 20% of older people were able to sell their family home and downsize or right-size to the accommodation more suitable to their needs, then that would release over 840,000 family-sized homes onto the market. Another issue that we found that puts some older people off moving into retirement accommodation is the lack of transparency about what they can expect in terms of charges and the services that they will receive. And we therefore support the recommendation in the report that there should be greater clarity around fees and charges involved in retirement housing. Another aspect to this, of course, is that anyone that's experienced a crisis that often results in a loved one having to go into care home as an emergency at short notice would wish to avoid it at all costs. And although these events will, of course, always happen, sadly, I think there would be a massive reduction in the number of families having to go through these crises, instead of being able to take their time with their older family members to choose the appropriate accommodation that meets their requirements when the time comes. I think out of the report that Gareth already mentioned, there's two key statistics. The first one is that alternatives to care homes are required by 94% of those people that responded. They really want this to happen. And that 70% of those that responded would be interested in moving to housing that has care available on site as an alternative to moving into a care home. I don't think you can get a clearer message than that there is a demand for this sort of accommodation. So we hope the government will respond to this report and that it will mean that there are the right policies coming forward to empower older people to live fulfilling later lives. I think it's also important to consider that by making a choice to give people that option to make a decision for themselves, that there'll be less demand on the social care and health sectors, because I think we all are aware that wherever you live, it has a massive impact on your well-being. And I think Lord Best said earlier on that, you know, COVID has made us all appreciate where we live or not appreciate where we live, depending on your circumstances. So it's important to get that right. Finally, I'd just like to say that we think the idea of a housing with care task force is an excellent one, but we would really like to see older people involved in that task force. And I'd just like to finish by saying we think this is a really great start to looking at this area of housing. And we have enjoyed working with ARCO, and we very much look forward to working with them in the future on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Lisa. And we come now to the people who you were pointing the finger at, the politicians, the policymakers, to see what they made of this new report, starting with Barbara Keeley. Barbara, Labour MP for Worsley and Eccles South, several ministerial roles, including very significantly Shadow Minister for Older People, Social Care and Carers. And I know that Barbara's also got a lot of local government experience. So Barbara, give us your take on this.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you for inviting me to speak today at the launch of this timely report. Ensuring that people are able to grow old in their own homes, surrounded by a friendly community, sounds like a modest ambition. It's what most of us want for our later years. But for too many people in the UK today, this isn't the reality that they're facing. Instead, inappropriate housing and constrained social care budgets mean that people are often pushed towards moving into care homes, often before they're ready to do so, or when even they don't want to do so. So the reason I say this report is timely is that we've seen over recent months the downsides of living in care homes, and you referred to those, Lord Best, and I think they're a very serious situation, because many residents have ended up socially isolated with no contact with their families for months on end. Now, there are some care home residents who need the 24/7 support that a care home provides, but for many more, they are there because it wasn't deemed safe for them to remain in their own homes anymore. And we all know that that's not inevitable. It's the result of policy choices that mean that most older people live in inaccessible housing, and there are no or not enough more accessible alternatives nearby for them to move to. And I think this is compounded by a lack of suitable care. Local authorities' social care budgets, we know, are stretched to breaking point, and it must be tempting to promote care homes over home care, because in some cases this shifts the responsibility for paying back onto the person using the services. What this means is that we see older people moved into care homes not because they want to necessarily, or that they couldn't be supported elsewhere, but because the alternatives aren't there or aren't being promoted. Now, just in terms of levels of demand, since 2014, the number of people receiving care in their own homes has fallen by around 400,000. And that is despite an ageing population and growing unmet need for social care services. What this report makes clear is that there is a clear demand out there for alternatives to care homes. As has been mentioned, 95% of older people want an alternative to care homes. And I feel that now, as we are hoping that the government comes up with a social care reform and a strategy, there's a duty on them to ensure that those alternatives are provided. Now, planning decisions are rightly devolved to the local level, but I feel this has created an unacceptably patchy picture when it comes to the provision of accessible and adaptable housing. We've seen in London that action on a regional level can work, and I'm glad that Andy Burnham is using his role as mayor to do the same in Greater Manchester. But we have to accept that huge swathes of the country simply don't have the accessible housing provision that they need. I do think we need national oversight to ensure that a wide range of housing options are accessible. That could be minimum levels of provision, which local authorities have to aim for, as they currently do with other types of housing, or government support for developers who are providing those homes. And this support should not be solely focused just on accessible homes. I agree with the call in this report for the government to promote alternatives to care homes, and that can mean retirement communities or extra care developments. What's important is that we don't see older people living in isolated units where their only contact is with care staff. And as we've already said, the current crisis has shown some of the most unfortunate aspects of living in a care home. It is also the case that many care homes do a great job in creating a sense of community. And as the older population becomes more diverse, that sense of community will be more important than ever. There was a recent example of an LGBT plus extra care facility in Manchester, and that's a good example of how services can ensure that everyone can access support which works for them in a community that they feel comfortable with. I'm particularly interested in what this report says about increasing provision outside urban centres. At the moment, new housing is often concentrated in inner cities or in suburbs, in fact, in constituencies like mine. And that can mean that while an older person in an urban area may have a variety of choices available, an older person in a rural area may not. This regional provision in variation in provision is letting people down. We have to make sure that we don't simply recreate this pattern in future. And I think that's where developers and providers have to step up. As MPs and peers here today, we can do our bit by putting pressure on the government to support schemes, but ultimately it's not the government which is going to build houses. So we need developers to push for innovative ideas like these, and we need to make it easy for local authorities to say yes to them. So to conclude, I think this report is very timely. I hope it creates some of the changes needed to create that more accessible accommodation and those retirement communities and extra care developments which older people want and need.
Barbara, thank you very much indeed. Moving on now, Damian Green, Conservative MP for Ashford. Again, many ministerial and indeed cabinet posts, but always a special interest, I think, in social care. Damian, very glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you everyone who's on the call, as it were. The great danger of webinars like this is that you have a panel that violently agree with each other. And I don't disagree with much of what Barbara just said. And looking at the report itself, I think we all come at this, anyone who's thought about this whole area, to agree that there is a massive unmet need, which the report exposes very well. And indeed, I would go slightly further than the report and say that the massive unmet need covers not just retirement communities. I appreciate that's what ARCO is about, but the retirement housing option as well. That altogether, there's just not enough of it, even before we get to issues of quality and location, where I did very much agree with what Barbara just said about the fact that it needs to be around the country more, particularly in rural areas, in constituencies like mine. And I come the, if you like, the retirement housing issue through the prism of social care, which was one of the things I was responsible for when I was first secretary, and I deliberately grabbed it to the centre, to the cabinet office, because one of the great problems, one of the reasons why this has been for decades an unmet need, is that it's both a housing and a health issue. And the way Whitehall works, it has always just fallen between the cracks, that there are huge numbers of pressures always on the health service. We see it very, very explicitly now. And just putting social care in the health department doesn't mean that social care particularly goes up the agenda of the health department. But there's also the problem that the local government department, or whatever it's called, the housing department, MHCLG as it now is, always has a wider priority of just increasing housing numbers more generally. And so often, because there are numbers involved, even if we got up to acceptable levels, and I take Gareth's point that we're massively underprovided in this country compared to other countries, that still doesn't add a huge amount of their numbers. So I think the important thing now for those of us who wish to promote this agenda is to use social care policy and the fact that this long-term failure to produce a sustainable social care system as a bridge between the two. And where we are now is that actually we have some months to do that, because we haven't had a comprehensive spending review this November, which was the original plan. Because of COVID, I mean, very sensibly, the government decided to take a look at where its finances are for a slightly longer term. So we won't get the comprehensive spending review until next October, November now. And at the moment, as I understand it, the current plans inside government are that that will be the moment at which the social care policy is unveiled. So between now and then, I think it is really important to try to make the point as strongly as possible that one of the contributions to having a sustainable social care system is obviously keep that system as affordable as possible. And one of the really significant ways to do that, which we simply fail to do in this country, is to keep as many people out of residential care for as long as possible. And this is not only good for the Treasury, or good news for families who are having to pay for it, It's also good news for the people involved. As the survey showed, most people, for obvious reasons, want to live in their own home for as long as they can. What we failed to do is provide homes that are suitable for people who may be slightly frail but not very frail to live in absolutely for as long as possible, hopefully forever, as it were. So I think the push in policy terms over the next year needs to be, so you go through a sort of set of arguments that follow inexorably from each other. The first is the unquestioned point that we should keep as many people at home for as long as is possible. Secondly, that therefore we have got to build suitable and attractive housing for these people who live in for as long as possible. And it may be that some of them will go through the various tiers that you pointed out. You may go into super retirement housing and then into a retirement community at various points. But what the thing that we've never quite managed to do in this country is, as somebody who builds kind of housing once put it to me, make your last home your best home, so that you actively want to be there. This is not just a question of downsizing because you've got too weak to walk up the stairs, or you can't keep the garden up, or anything like that. This is actually somewhere that you want to show off to your friends, as it were, and you're proud to live in. In the further written down, which I think that people involved in marketing will want to work on, is that we need to make downsizing cool. You want to be proud to move out of that family home you've been clinging to for a long time, for all the obvious reasons. But to do that, if people with choice, and the point made about the variegated nature of new generations of older people we're coming to, a lot of them will be reasonably affluent, will have spent their lives being reasonably in control of their lives, and frankly are not going to start wanting to be pushed around just because they're in their 70s or 80s or something like that. They will want to go where they want to go, to a place they find suitable. And as I said, most people enjoy their house and showing it to friends and things like that. That's the nirvana we need to get to. And if we get there, then there will be less demand for residential care, which is good news for the Department for Health and Social Care, and indeed for the Treasury, who are clearly a big player in this. But also, to get there, we will need to build more of this desirable housing, which is good news for MHCLG and its housing targets. So frankly, it's a win-win all round. And if it can be phrased in those terms, then I think the policy push towards this, which I agree needs to come on a cross-party basis over the next year, and indeed from people outside as well, then I think it is possible that we can have this as it'll be a minor part of the social care policy that emerges, but it will be an absolutely vital part. And I do think the next year is going to be really important in trying to achieve that. Thanks, Richard.
Damian, many thanks. And you're going to stay for a few questions in a moment, please. That was great. Final speaker, Nick Sanderson. Nick looks after Audley, famous developer of retirement communities. Let's hear the perspective of the providers, the producers, the operators. Nick.
Thank you, Richard, and good afternoon, everybody. Can I just start by thanking the LLA and all my colleagues at ARCO for this report, which couldn't be more timely, I think, actually, at a point where we're looking now quite rightly at what the lessons learned of this year, this very difficult year, and what we can take from it and make sure that next time we're faced with such a challenge, we've got a housing and social care system that's fit for a new generation of older people. Truthfully, for those of us who have the responsibility of supplying to meet this market, there were some elements of this which were really not surprising, as you would expect. fact that 90% of those asked feel that the government should widen the options for older people. The fact actually that 56% of those asked would consider making a move to improve their housing and care options as they get older. Really not very surprising. We see that every day of the week from an Audley and Mayfield perspective in our 22 villages around the country. People now, particularly over the last few months, we've seen unprecedented levels of demand for what we do, which is very much a housing with care and lifestyle option. It is a very attractive option for people, particularly faced, as they have been, living in family homes which are no longer really appropriate, and where they've been isolated from their families, their communities and local services, etc. Not surprisingly, they're looking for new alternatives. What was really interesting to see, I thought, and again, maybe not that surprising to me, was that of those, 70% would consider a housing with care alternative if it meant avoiding a care home. Now, I don't think there'll be anybody on this call, I don't think anybody in your family, anybody you know would put their hand up and say they want to and are looking forward to moving into a care home. It should, as a society, be a burden on us, a responsibility on us to try and reduce the number of people who go into institutionalized care to the small number of people who have specialist and complex needs at the end of their lives. All those who could live an independent life, it's sort of beholden on us, I think, particularly for a new generation of older people, to find a better alternative. And they are there and they're out there, and it's my job and my colleagues in the sector's job to provide them, because they do work. And of course, they make a really valuable contribution to what Damian was saying about the integrated care path, the continuum of care of a generation from relatively early in their years of retirement, right the way through to the end of their lives. It needs an integrated solution. We are ready to respond, actually, as a sector. Though we're relatively small in the UK compared with, for instance, our colleagues in New Zealand, where there seems to be a retirement village on every street corner. I think they've got 10 times the number of retirement communities with a population less than 10th our size. We have got a long way to go, but just as our potential customers through this survey have shown that something that they want, that's being matched now by increased enthusiasm from the investment community. We have major life and pensions providers as partners of ours, but also with the sector, with AXA and Legal & General and many others, Royal London, Schroders, various people coming in to support growth within the sector. So you might ask why it is we've taken so long to expand to meet this obviously significant demand. Well, some would sit here and say, well, it's not our fault, it's the government's fault, there's no lack of clarity, there's a lack of clarity, lack of category definition. That's not really the case. It's just that the sector hasn't really geared itself up to deliver the sort of volume that would really make a difference. As part of what we have to do, as Damian also just said, is make this commonplace, make it cool, make it understood. There's still far too much confusion about what these varied offers are between retirement housing, housing with care, retirement communities. So we have to get some clarity. That's a responsibility on us in the language we use and what we describe. And ARCO has always been about that category definition piece, as Richard started by saying, defining what it is and how it sits within that continuum of care. That's our job. Truthfully, we need some help from government, but mostly that's just a push. It doesn't need vast amounts of capital advanced from government. It doesn't need Treasury to write checks. The reality is, for the fortunate 72 or 73% of over 65s who own their own homes, they have between them over £1 trillion worth of housing wealth created, which itself is something that can fuel their demand for this supply. In Audley's case, almost all of our customers have sold a home to buy a home. So the capital is there from them. Its capital is there from us to provide. All we need in terms of support is local authorities, I think, to recognise the need for what we do, particularly housing with care as a category, to ensure that when they're doing their housing allocations, they consider it and actually almost insist on it, that for any new development allocations within their areas, a proportion goes for this category. Because I think behind that, once the land is made available, planning policy will be better defined as more product comes forward, and we will be there to provide the supply so that more and more people live like the people. I've just come from one of our villages, actually, many who have a considerable amount of care delivered to them within their own homes, who in other circumstances would have been within a residential care setting, where they would have lost their independence and to some extent a lot of their personal dignity, where they would have been fearful, particularly at the moment of COVID-19, and where frankly we as a society, as I say, should work really hard to keep them out for as long as possible. That of course has many downstream benefits. It means our customers are freeing up their family homes, as was said earlier, for families who are desperately in need of those housing. But it's also keeping people out of not just social care, but out of the health system. One question I'm always wanting to ask is if 25,000 people were discharged quickly from acute hospitals into residential care at the beginning of the pandemic, what were they doing there in the first place? They were there because they had a crisis that had meant admission into an acute hospital, when frankly, if they'd had the right housing solutions and support available to them in their home previously, those events may not have occurred, which meant they could have stayed independent in their homes for longer. So we really welcome the report. We're ready to respond as a sector. We do what our best, a little bit of help in certain areas to push it. And I think this can be the beginning and a major contribution to a significant expansion in growth in housing with care in the UK.
Nick, thank you very, very much for that. And we come now to our questions session. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of my screen, probably the bottom of yours too. Please use that. And then Gareth will sift and sort the questions as they come in, and they'll appear on my chat box side, and I'll put them to my colleagues here. So let's just unpack one or two things that have emerged so far. And Nick, you were saying that you don't really need any government funding because your clients are able to sell their homes and move in. Of course, that counts out those people who have a house that's not worth very much, or indeed those who are currently tenants and don't have anything to sell. And I think that we ought to just underline that, since we have politicians listening in, that we are going to need government resource to enable people who are in lower value properties or in rented property to move into the extra care accommodation that a lot of housing associations are now beginning to understand are badly needed. So there's a parallel stream there that does require both grants to lower the capital costs and then housing benefit to cover the ongoing costs, and those are important. I don't know if any of my colleagues would like to comment on that one, but just to put that one on the record, we're going to need some.
Yes, I would just say, you'll absolutely agree with you. But interestingly, of the ARCO membership and the allocation across the sector, there's significantly more housing with care that's been created by the not-for-profits and charities than there are by private providers, actually. And that, of course, was with a big expansion in extra care, particularly actually in the last 10 to 15 years, local authorities reallocating their residential care resource to extra care. But also historically too, a lot of the retirement housing of the 70s and 80s has been adapted. So I think there's 60,000 units of affordable rented accommodation in the UK. The private sector actually is dwarfed by it, even though, as I said, nearly 3/4 of people do own their own homes. And I think the extra care, there's some big programs of extra care housing around the UK. And yes, that does need some support. But actually, of course, the cost of that to the state is dwarfed by what would be the cost if they left it too late and then people ended up in expensive residential or acute.
Definitely. Huge savings to the health service and indeed to social care. Damian, did you want to come in?
I did. Thank you, Richard, because I wanted to pick up, I think it makes it quite profound there that actually in as much as we provide this type of supported housing, whatever you want to call it, it's done perhaps disproportionately by the public sector for those who you expect, well, will need it because they've either been tenants or don't have enough money to pay for one of Nick's top of the range operations. And actually, this is a sort of more a private sector market failure. And a consequence of that is that I suspect out there is a feeling that retirement communities, supported housing, whatever you want to call it, is something you have to go into if you're forced to, rather than because you want to. And it's actually reversing that psychology that's one of the very important things we need to do, so that the unmet demand that the report showed will actually be met. Because if people sort of slightly think, oh gosh, I'm being forced to do this, then they want to do it. And if they don't want to do it, then what is a demand expressed when people answer a survey will not actually be expressed in the real world when people come to spend their money and take their own very important life decisions.
Absolutely. Any of my other panelists want to throw in a comment on this one? Please raise a hand so I see you on the screen. All okay. Nick then mentioned also the question of planning and the extent to which local planning authorities can play their part. My all-party parliamentary group has banged on about the value of planners to making things happen quite a bit. The planning white paper is not very helpful. The planning white paper doesn't mention older people. Lots and lots of stuff about younger people, but as we all know, you get 2 for 1 if you can house older people. And we've made in our response to the planning white paper, we've made the point that planners ought to think in terms, because the demography of their area shows it, they ought to think in terms of at least 10% of the housing that is constructed in their areas being specifically for older people in its different forms. That is, if you're a major developer, one of the sort of Persimmons or Barratts or whatever, part of the requirements on you should be to allocate a proportion of your development for older people, not including people of all income ranges. And indeed, we think that specific sites, often town centre sites, ought to be allocated exclusively for older people's housing. This can put the retirement housing operators into pole position in terms of getting a development done, because otherwise they're always going to lose out to other uses. The Aldi supermarket or the Audi showroom will always pip them at the post. But so planners, we've said, can be really significant players in this. I don't know whether any colleagues would like to comment on that. Barbara, please.
I think you're right, Richard. It's pretty important. I mean, I think the trouble is that due to cuts in local government, I think planning departments have been cut to the bone, and I think it's starting to show now that they don't have enough planners there doing the work on things like this. But if I can just reflect on Greater Manchester, we've got a very controversial planning issue going through at the moment, a new framework, the Greater Manchester Strategic Framework. And you're quite right, Richard, because the considerations there, a lot of them are about green belt and loss of green belt, which always comes up. But it's just about the proportion that's affordable, not the proportion that's accessible. So what you have just said is quite right. It's not even there when an area as large as Greater Manchester is doing strategic planning, and it should be. Because I would say that a third of my casework as a member of Parliament in Greater Manchester is on housing, and a lot of it is around these issues, and we just do not have suitable accommodation, nothing like suitable accommodation. So clearly planning and making that proviso that you've just made the point about, I agree with you, it's totally important and vital to this discussion.
Thanks. Nick?
Yes, I think most people expect me, working in the private sector, to have a go at planners and the planning system. I actually agree a bit with what Barbara said. They are very under-resourced, and priorities therefore go to who shouts loudest, and the house builders have a very loud voice. And it's been Damian described it as our private market failure, and I agree with that. I don't think we do a good enough job of explaining to them what it is we do. I think there can be some help, and MHCLG are very aware of this, I think, in terms of giving some strong guidance to local authorities. They don't need to change the planning class uses particularly, but actually to give some clarity around the different definitions of what it is that can be provided, what's a priority, and encourage planners to build that into, as I said earlier, their housing allocation as much as their planning policies. Because I agree with you, absolutely, Richard. I mean, if Barratt get permission for 3,000 houses on the edge of a new development area, it is wholly inappropriate that there's not one reference to older people that obliges a local authority to consider the needs of the older population in their community. In fact, actually, they often positively move away from it because they think it's going to be a burden on their local services, even though those people already live within their district. So some push, that's really what I meant, a push rather than a huge amount of primary legislation, simply to say when you are devising your planning housing strategies, you must consider older people. Less than 10% of authorities in the country have specific policies around an older population, which is ridiculous when they represent such a significant proportion.
Absolutely. Did you want to come in, Damian?
Yes, thanks. Just to pick up on that point, I'm candidly surprised it's as many as 10%, because the point was made to me, which we put in the report I did about social care for the Centre for Policy Studies, is that in private, quite a lot of local authorities will admit that almost the last thing they want to do is to attract more old people to come and live there, because they can see perfectly well under the current system where they fund care provision out of council tax, that if they change the demographics of their particular local area, then they are going to be spending much more money in the future. And unless and until we solve that conundrum, I suggest making sure that it's funded out of national taxation rather than local taxation, but there are other ways of doing it. And also to the planning rules, I agree with all the points made about planning white paper, then we won't make any progress on this in terms of what local authorities actually want to have as a facility. They should want to do this. They should be competing with each other to provide the best housing for older people. But actually, the current financial system militates exactly in the opposite direction.
Absolutely. Lisa, you wanted to come in, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the attitudes to older people come out a little bit more, and the fact that if you cater for older people properly and you take into account what they want and perhaps put some housing into town centres, your town centres will be rejuvenated because you'll have people that want to shop locally, that want to make the most of the facilities, that want to volunteer, that want to participate in their community. And I think there's a little bit too much thought about what the burden might be of having a higher population of older people, and not enough thinking about what older people can actually offer. I think that's a big mistake. We need to think about that going forward.
You're so right. When we were doing the HAPPY report, this was our Housing for Our Aging Population panel for innovation. We went to Malmo in Sweden. We went to a lot of the Scandinavian countries, and annoyingly, they all get it so right, don't they? And we leave us so far behind. It's infuriating. But in Malmo, the local plan, the strategy for the area started with, let's put a large development of retirement housing right at the center of this, looking out over the sea, because these people are not going to be mobile, here today, gone tomorrow. They're going to settle in, use the local shops, become very much part of the fabric of the community. They are the anchors. This is the anchor community. And we saw this smashing development, beautifully, of course, designed, but also, socially, such a value added extra to that new settlement of Malmo. The other thing, just to say, Damian, because you know we all get this one about oh, we don't want more old people around here. The average distance, I think it was our friends at McCarthy and Stone who did the measurement of how far people moved into a McCarthy and Stone apartment block. And I think that the average distance was 2.9 miles, something like that. People are already there. The people who will be in the new extra care setting are actually just around the corner, and it'll be costing the local authority an awful lot less to deliver services in that setting than having people travel around and about, probably not being paid for their travel time and all the hassle and difficulties of that. To collect people in one place is much more economic and much easier, rather than going out to people's unsuitable housing and helping them climb the stairs and all the things that carers have to do for people in inappropriate settings. So it's about savings for the social services, for the adult care services. It's not about adding a burden. Anyway, I think we can't say that too often.
You and I know that, but sadly, not enough people running adult social care systems now, I think.
Infuriating. So other questions. I was just gonna pick up on this question of what more could government do apart from grant aiding extra care schemes of housing associations. There is this idea, and I'm afraid we've been promoting it from my all-party group, of having stamp duty relief for older people acquiring their more suitable, their right-sizing home, because we, rather than a stigma about moving, the idea would be to have an incentive that older people would feel, well, we get this special privilege. We don't have to turn it down. It's worth several thousands of pounds. Perhaps we ought to think more about the downsizing option. Stamp duty at the moment has been lifted for everyone, but only until March. Should we keep it on after the spring, just for older people, to really try to get to this tipping point where it's a much more natural thing to think about moving on to right-sizing, freeing up those family homes? This may be an opportunity. I don't know whether colleagues feel it's fanciful.
Well, I'll repeat a story I've probably told you before, but I remember going with a legation, I think you might call it, to the Treasury to have that conversation, sitting around a very big table in their very fine office, making the point exactly, because you're quite right, it's not the single benefit to the older person, it's the sequential benefit of all of the transactions that happen behind it. So you'll have, you know, giving stamp duty relief to a first-time buyer helps that first-time buyer, yes, but doesn't really help anybody else within the housing chain. Helping somebody at the top end of the chain means that 3 or 4 houses will happen behind them, transactions will happen behind, which means the overall benefit to the Treasury is significant. It actually is a net gain to the Treasury. And I made that point and said, just as you said, wouldn't it be nice to help older people by giving them some encouragement to downsize? And they said, yeah, fine, really interesting, never going to happen. Helping old people who have had enough benefit through the increase in their house value over the last 35 years. We're not going to be seen to help them anymore.
Quiet. Now, John, anybody else want to come in on government incentives of that kind, the stamp duty variety? Barbara.
I think there's a few barriers, aren't there? But I think that would overcome one of them. I think providing an incentive. But my thought on some of the questions that are coming up now is, like social care, this whole issue is not discussed enough until too late. People are not planning enough for this move, this final move as has been discussed. So I think the language is important. I think a number of points are being made about language. But the sheer thing is that people don't think about it. You know, sticking in the family home for as long as possible just seems to be a standard pattern. And there is almost no encouragement to people to sort of think about and work through the options. And I think that's a big change we've got to bring about, in the same way that we've got to bring about the change that people plan for options for care that they're going to need when they're older. But the housing that goes along with that is an important part of it. And I think, you know, this addressing this issue about care homes, and the word care doesn't mean it's a care home, is pretty important.
Absolutely. It was John Galvin of the Elderly Accommodation Council who's asking us about advice on how to get the government to refund National Housing Options advice services for older people. At the moment, if you've got a pension pot, you can get that free advice, that is it called a golden hour, or that invaluable advice on whether or not you should draw out your pension or what you should do with it. But if you've got a house that's worth an awful lot more than your pension pot, you don't get any free advice of that kind. And to have this kind of guidance laid on for you, that a 1 hour session, wow, we could hear all about equity release. You haven't got quite enough to buy the new home that you'd like to move to, the aspiration that you have, the ambition that you have to move in. You haven't got quite enough. Well, it could be equity release does it. It could be there will be ways of the financial wizards making it work for you. But people don't get that advice. Nick, is that
well,
fair?
no, I was just very briefly, I don't know, but I've just seen Simon Bottery's comment actually on, and I agree completely with Barbara's point about language. The reason people leave it too late is because they're in denial, because they're fearful, because actually they're fearful that if they ask for help, somebody will take them off and put them into a care home in its very simplest form. And any alternative that's presented that looks like group accommodation for older people, they assume is a care home. And that's again a failure of ours too, in terms of language. As Simon rightly said, there's a multitude of different terms used for different purposes, whether you're trying to get planning permission or whether you're trying to market something. And people are very confused, and it's our job to give clarity as to what these offer are. And again, as Damian said earlier, to make it aspirational, and to make it a proactive move, not a reactive move at the point of crisis.
Lisa.
I've been to a few sort of debates and discussions about later life, and there was one that I thought was particularly good, and it was talking about how you plan for later life. It was actually connected with social care and paying for social care, and the idea was that you looked at your assets and what you had, including your home. But I think, you know, there would be certainly something to be done about thinking, just planning for later life, whether it's around pensions or where you're going to live or what care you might need, because you know, as people have said at this event and the panel, people don't like to think about social care and the possible need of it. But if it was brought out and you started thinking about it when you're in your mid-50s, say, you know, that might be something to think about. You know, just give everybody some free advice. I think that would be the way to go. Just raise awareness, get people thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. As they are helped to think about their pension pot, which government has committed to, and apparently that's a really helpful service. But no use at all if it's your assets are in your home, and for so many people they are, and that is the key to what you do next. Yeah, Damian.
Just, I mean, picking up two of the themes that are coming through in various questions. I think all those who are asking for the government to fund X and Y, or indeed, in your case, to sort of cut stamp duty and in the report, this may be very timely, I should say. That Nick told the story of the Treasury saying, basically, we're not going to give subsidies to people expensive homes. I guess that conversation took place before the government borrowed £400 billion in a year or whatever they've done over the past 9 months. So all squeezes on the Treasury are much, much worse now by many quanta than they were any time before this year. So we have to bear that. But I do think that the language debate and the knowledge debate is actually really constructive. And that, you know, that should certainly come from government. And I take the point that the government is much better at giving advice on pensions than it used to, and isn't at all, you know, aspire to give advice on housing when it probably should. But that also it affects both the private and the third sector as well. That if the word care attached to anything becomes a sort of code for, oh, this is going to be something you don't want to do, then the entire sector will remain infected. So absolutely, there's got to be agreed terms that, with proper marketing campaigns and use of the same language over the years. And only then will you start engaging people and stop. I completely agree with Nick. People don't think about it because they don't like to think about being old and about the fact that their horizons are closing in. So you've got to give them something to look forward to. Otherwise, they will keep pushing this thought to the bottom of the pile, and therefore not taking the financial decisions or any other type of decisions that they ought to take when they want to, rather than when they absolutely have to in a crisis, or even worse, are in such a bad crisis that their children are having to take for them, with an even bigger degree of ignorance and quite likely some guilt attached to saying how we ended up like this, which, that's a sort of slight parody of where we are, but it's not a huge and appalling parody. And that's what we need to change.
Absolutely. Well, look, we've run out of time. I'm extremely grateful to all my panelists. Let me just leave you with this thought. In 2010, the nation built 28,000 homes specifically for older people, 28,000 new homes. That was in the private sector and in the social housing sector. Last year, before COVID and everything, we built 7,000, down from 20. Why suddenly do we need vastly fewer homes for older people in all their varieties, in retirement communities, extra care schemes, and indeed in just straightforward downsizing developments? Why do we need vastly fewer? We don't. We know we don't. And if government has this ambition of 300,000 homes a year, very honourable ambition to try and build the homes that we need, well, at least 10%, 30,000, much the same as a decade ago, is needed. And we've got to get back to that. So I hugely welcome the ARCO LLA report today. Well done, ARCO. Well done, Gareth and Lisa, representing those two parts of us today. Many thanks to Damian and Barbara. This is a cross-party issue of the highest magnitude of importance. Thank you both very much for sharing thoughts. And Nick, as chair of ARCO and as a real practitioner out there doing some great schemes, thank you too. So many thanks to everybody, and Katie for looking after us today. Thank you all for joining us and for your questions. Farewell.